Good afternoon. My name is Greg Husock. I'm an information officer with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. My role in this webinar is to narrate today's presentation. Please note that all three webinars will be posted online at mndnr.gov/line3 a few days after each webinar. That's mndnr.gov/line3. Before we begin, I'd like to provide some information about how you can manage your viewing of the webinar. Your screen is showing the presentation panel on the right and a panel for submitting questions on the left. The question panel can be minimized or it can be removed by clicking on the X in the top right corner of the panel. You can make the panel reappear by selecting the question mark button at the bottom center of your screen. The buttons at the bottom of your screen control audio, slide viewing, and the question and answer panel. The broad agenda for today includes a welcome from Commissioner Stroman, a presentation, and a question and answer section. During the presentation portion, we will provide information on the public comment opportunity, discuss the webinar series, and provide a brief project overview that summarizes what was covered in the first webinars. The majority of today's webinar will focus on the details of the 10 applications that Enbridge has submitted and discuss the regulatory requirements associated with each of these applications. The webinar will end with a question and answer session that will last approximately 30 minutes. Questions can be typed into the question and answer panel on your screen at any time. Those of you at remote viewing locations can submit your questions using the cards provided. Hand your questions to the DNR facilitator at the site so that they can enter them into the webinar platform for consideration. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. When the webinars are complete, the DNR will review all questions submitted and provide answers to the most common questions or those that are broadly applicable in a frequently asked questions section of the webpage mndnr.gov/line3. Now we will hear briefly from DNR Commissioner Sarah Stroman.
Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Stroman. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar regarding the proposed Enbridge Line 3 replacement project. I hope you were able to join us for our initial webinar on April 29th, when we provided an overview of the project and DNR's permitting process. Today, we are going to go into a bit more detail regarding the applications Enbridge has submitted to DNR. But first, I want to emphasize that at DNR, we understand that the Line 3 replacement project has generated many questions, both about the potential benefits and impacts of the project, and also about the state's regulatory authority. Through our webinar series, we are hoping to answer important questions you may have about the project and DNR's role. We want to provide you with the very best information possible to help you participate effectively in the public process for this high-profile project. Enbridge has applied for several DNR permits and licenses needed to construct the project. Among these are applications for water appropriations, utility crossings of state lands and waters, and threatened and endangered species impacts. On March 18th, the DNR announced the start of a 60-day public comment period on these applications. This comment period ends on May 17th. The content of today's webinar is being presented on both April 30th and May 6th. We will present a brief project overview and discuss the DNR permits and licenses Enbridge needs to proceed with its project. The majority of today's presentation will provide more detailed information about the applications that Enbridge has submitted and specifics about what DNR must consider when reviewing these applications. This information will help you understand the specific application content as well as how DNR will consider the applications. We want people to understand that DNR is a neutral party. As with all projects we regulate, DNR's role in the Line 3 replacement project is to provide a rigorous and independent assessment of the applications. Using sound science, we will carefully consider the available data and public input in determining whether the proposed project meets the requirements of Minnesota law. In a moment, we'll start with today's presentation. Following the presentation, you will have the opportunity to submit questions to DNR staff, and we will answer as many as we can in the available time. DNR is committed to providing you with the best information possible about our work on the Line 3 project. Our webinars will be posted on our website, where you can also find Enbridge's applications and other information. I invite you to check out all of our information at mndnr.gov/line3. I also encourage you to use this website to submit your comments on the applications by May 17th. Please understand that the most effective comments will be those that address how the Enbridge applications do or do not meet applicable state standards. Expressions of opinion about the merits of the project, while welcome, do not help inform our ultimate decisions. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to receiving your comments by May 17th.
To start the presentation, I will share more information about how you can provide comments on the Line 3 project. The DNR has developed a web page dedicated to the Line 3 applications that Enbridge has submitted. The web page contains project information and the applications that are under consideration. The web page address again is mndnr.gov/line3 with the numeral 3. To stay informed about the DNR's consideration of Enbridge's applications, please sign up for email updates from the Gov Delivery Service on this web page. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide information that would assist the public in submitting comments on Enbridge's applications. The public comment period ends at 4:30 p.m. May 17th. The specific applications that are subject to public comment include a utility license to cross state land, a utility license to cross public water, work in public waters. There are 2 individual work in public waters applications. Water appropriation. There are 4 individual water appropriation applications. A calcareous fen management plan, and a threatened and endangered species takings application. We'll provide details about each of these applications in today's webinar. As a reminder, the intent of this webinar is to provide an overview of the project, explain the DNR's regulatory controls, and help you understand how and when to provide comment. However, this webinar is not a forum for accepting public comments on the applications. There are alternative means for doing this. Specifically, you can submit public comment either at the Minnesota DNR Line 3 informational webpage or by mailing comments to the DNR. The intent of the public comment period is to provide information to the public about what Enbridge is requesting and to seek input on the provided application information, areas that need special attention, and potential permit conditions for consideration. The DNR's role is to ensure that pipeline construction and operation within DNR jurisdiction is completed in a manner that avoids or minimizes harm to natural resources within the authorized corridor in accordance with state laws. The most helpful comments will be specific to 1 or more applications pending before the DNR and will address additional information needed in the applications, identification of specific resources or areas that warrant special consideration, recommendations on permit and license conditions or limitations, or the application's consistency with state statute and rule. Opinions about the project are welcome, but comments that express support for or opposition to the project as a whole do not relate to the criteria the DNR must use in making its decisions on pending applications. Next in the agenda, I will tell you more about the webinar series. This is a three-part webinar series. The first webinar was a general overview of the project, how to provide public comments, and explanation of the DNR's regulatory controls. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency also provided a brief explanation about their Line 3 replacement regulatory programs and upcoming opportunities for public engagement. This webinar was April 29th and is posted at the Minnesota DNR Line 3 webpage for viewing. The second and third webinars differ from Webinar 1 by describing in more detail the content of the applications and requirements of the various DNR regulatory programs. Webinars 2 and 3 will have the same presentation content in each. These webinars will also have a question and answer period following the presentation. All of the webinars will be posted online at the Minnesota DNR Line 3 webpage. Now we will move to an overview of the Line 3 project, including construction, operations, and review by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Enbridge's existing Line 3 pipeline is a 282-mile, 34-inch diameter pipeline that was constructed in the 1960s and is part of Enbridge's mainline system that transports oil across Minnesota. The existing Line 3 has known integrity issues and safety risks that have resulted in limitations on amounts and types of oil being transported by the pipeline. The Line 3 replacement project proposes to replace the existing pipeline with a new pipeline using modern design, manufacturing, coating, and installation techniques. Enbridge proposes to replace Line 3 with a 330-mile, 36-inch pipe that also has an increased wall thickness over the existing Line 3. The Line 3 replacement would follow the existing Enbridge mainline corridor from the North Dakota border through Kittson, Marshall, Pennington, Red Lake, and Polk counties to the Clearbrook terminal in Clearwater County. From this location, the Line 3 replacement would deviate from the Enbridge mainline corridor and travel south to southern Hubbard County, then turn east through Wadena, Cass, Crow Wing, and Aiken counties. The Line 3 replacement would rejoin the Enbridge mainline corridor in southwestern St. Louis County, west of the Fond du Lac Reservation, and then follow the mainline corridor through Carleton County to the Wisconsin border. Deactivation of the existing Line 3 would occur after construction of the Line 3 replacement under separate DNR permit and license, although the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission decision on the Certificate of Need for Line 3 replacement includes a special condition that addresses the disposition of the existing Line 3. The current applications under review by the DNR do not address existing Line 3 deactivation. Project construction would occur on a permanent 50-foot right-of-way that is contained within a temporary construction corridor that varies between 95 and 120 feet. There would also be additional temporary construction areas for staging equipment and materials, holding spoil material, and where construction methods require additional workspace. Project operation would include maintaining a 50-foot permanent right-of-way centered over the pipeline. This right-of-way would be maintained by removing woody shrubs and trimming trees to allow aerial inspection of the pipeline corridor. The Minnesota Public Utilities Commission issued a Certificate of Need and Route Permit to Enbridge for the Line 3 replacement project in June 2018. These authorizations represent the primary regulatory authority over the project within Minnesota. The Certificate of Need confirms the need for the project, and the route permit designates the specific route the pipeline must follow. The Certificate of Need and route permit both contain conditions that Enbridge must comply with as part of these approvals. The PUC decisions on the Certificate of Need and route are under appeal, and that is a separate process from the DNR review of permit applications. The DNR's review is not a reconsideration of the certificate of need or the route. Next in the agenda is a detailed look at the DNR regulatory controls. I will share information about each of the 10 applications the DNR is considering and the related regulatory requirements. The DNR does not have regulatory authority over the entire proposed Line 3 replacement. Our regulatory authority is limited to those areas where proposed construction and operation activities intersect natural resources, where the Minnesota legislature has granted regulatory authority to the DNR. In general, these areas include certain state lands, public water, groundwater, and rare resources such as calcareous fens and threatened or endangered species. More information on the applications and permit requirements will be provided later in this webinar, but the 10 specific permits that Enbridge would need to secure from the DNR for pipeline construction include a utility license to cross public land, one license for all state land, a utility license to cross public water, one license for all public water courses and basins, 2 work in public waters permits, one for construction in public water wetlands, and another for a bridge crossing the Willow River, 4 water appropriation permits, one for hydrostatic testing and horizontal directional drilling, another for construction dewatering, one for dust control, and one for the Gully 30 calcareous fen, a fen management plan for the Gully 30 calcareous fen, and a permit for threatened and endangered species takings. Enbridge has submitted applications for each of these permits, licenses, and authorizations. Below is a general description of each regulatory authority and how it applies to the Line 3 replacement project. The DNR is considering all applications simultaneously. This diagram is a rough outline of the steps of the DNR process for application consideration. The process begins with application submittal and DNR acceptance. We are currently in the public, agency, and internal review step of the process. After the comment period is over, the DNR will consider what has been provided and additional information may be collected. Once all the necessary information has been obtained and considered, decisions will be finalized. I will now walk through each type of DNR application. First, we have the utility license to cross public land. Enbridge's application requests a license to cross several state forests, public school trust land, aquatic management areas, and state trails. This would allow construction and operation of utilities across DNR-administered lands. This would address construction activities and could require conditions to protect and conserve natural resources. It would address loss of natural resource revenue from impacted state lands and allow continued operation of the utility, including general maintenance activities. Future integrity or maintenance digs would require additional authorizations. Both short and long-term leases would also be needed for construction and operation activities outside the utility license to cross corridor. Construction of the Line 3 replacement pipeline would require a license to cross 7 state forests. These forests are the Mississippi Headwaters, Huntersville, Foothills, Land O'Lakes, Hill River, Savannah, and Fond du Lac state forests. The remaining DNR-administered state land that would need a license to cross includes the Paul Bunyan State Trail, Willard Munger State Trail, Little Otter Creek Aquatic Management Area, and various public school trust lands. The application materials submitted by Enbridge are quite large, so we thought we would provide an orientation to the content of the application. The table of contents for the application identifies 10 specific sections. Sections 1 through 7, 9, and 10 of the application provide general information related to the project, including construction, operation, and deactivation. Section 8 of the application contains specific information about the activities proposed on state land. The application also contains a number of attachments that include additional details about project construction. Attachments A, B, and H are specific to the utility license to cross public land application. Attachment A is a list of the specific lands that would be crossed and other information about the crossing, such as locations and construction methods. This table can be used to identify specific state lands that you may be interested in. Attachment B contains maps of all the proposed land crossings. These maps include information about pipe location, construction areas, and access routes. Attachments C, D, E, F, G, I, and J contain various construction plans that apply more generally to the project. Some of these plans have been included as part of many different applications. The Environmental Protection Plan, Attachment E, is an example of a plan that is included in several DNR applications as well as MPCA applications. Evaluation criteria are specific aspects of the request that the DNR must consider when determining if the application can be approved or denied. These considerations are contained in the laws that grant the DNR the authority to issue utility licenses. For public lands, the request must minimize the adverse impacts and not conflict with the public use of the land. Applications must also address topography, vegetation, soil, public waters, location, appearance, construction methods, and safety. The DNR can impose specific terms in the license to ensure compliance with the laws. A license may be canceled for substantial violation of the terms contained in the license. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. These areas have been preliminarily identified by DNR staff as needing special attention. The proposed route crosses some very large peatland areas that can be difficult for construction and restoration. Construction in frozen conditions can help address some of these issues. Sites of biodiversity and native plant communities may require additional construction limitations or need additional mitigation for impacts to these important resources. Site restoration, monitoring for success, and implementation of remedial measures are areas that may need to be addressed in detail for state lands. Next, we have the utility license to cross public waters. Similar to public lands, the license to cross public waters would allow construction and operation of utilities across public waters where the state holds a land interest in the beds of the water. This generally includes public water basins, lakes, and water courses, rivers and streams, that are identified on the public water inventory. It does not include public water wetlands on private land that are identified on the public water inventory. These will be discussed later in the presentation. This license would address construction activities and can require conditions to protect and conserve natural resources. It would allow continued operation of a utility. Enbridge's application requests a license for 67 public waters. This includes 5 lakes and 62 rivers and streams. Similar to the application for public lands, the application for utility license to cross public waters has general project information in sections 1 through 7, 9, and 10. Section 8 contains information specific to the public waters that are proposed to be crossed. The application also contains a number of attachments that include additional details about project construction. Attachments A and B are specific to the utility license to cross public waters application. Attachment A is a list of the specific water crossings and other information about the crossing, such as length, timing, and construction methods. This table can be used to identify specific water crossings that you may be interested in. Attachment B contains maps of all the proposed public water crossings, and these maps include information on pipe locations, construction areas, and access routes. Similar to the application for utility license to cross public lands, the application for crossing public waters includes additional attachments that contain various construction plans that apply more generally to the project. These are attachments C, D, E, F, G, and I. The evaluation criteria for public waters are specific aspects of the request that the DNR must consider when determining if the application can be approved or denied. These considerations are contained in the laws that grant the DNR the authority to issue utility licenses. These criteria include avoid the crossing if feasible, cross at narrow locations, use existing corridors, and minimize encroachment into the water. Avoiding a specific water crossing at this time is difficult due to the route permit already being issued. Small shifts may be possible in certain circumstances. Crossing locations within the authorized route corridor can be shifted to minimize impacts on the resource by crossing at locations that minimize disruption of the public water. Examples of shift that the DNR has recommended include avoiding meander bends or avoiding crossing at angles that parallel the water course. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. These areas have been preliminarily identified by DNR staff as needing special attention. Enbridge has proposed specific crossing methods for each public water. Crossing methods can include open wet cut trenching, open dry cut trenching, or hydraulic directional drillings. Hydraulic directional drilling crossings avoid having to trench through the public water, but they are not always successful, and there is always the potential for an accidental release of drilling mud, or what is commonly called a frack out. Open cut trenching has additional construction impacts, but these types of crossings are more reliably constructed and can be completed in short time durations. Restoring public waters after pipeline construction can be difficult, and some previous pipeline crossings have done a poor job of maintaining stream shape and function. Additional details on public water restoration plans will likely be needed. Some public water crossings would be difficult to construct without significant impacts to the resource. Construction across Spring Brook and Little Otter Creek have been identified as potentially problematic crossings. Next, Minnesota maintains a list of state threatened and endangered species. This list is separate and distinct from the federal list of threatened and endangered species. The takings permit is required for any activity that would impact a threatened or endangered species. Precursors to applying for a takings permit are needed to ensure species have been properly identified through approved survey methods, and that all reasonable measures have been taken to avoid taking the species. Enbridge's application proposes to take 9 different plant species for a total of 7,212 individual plants. Enbridge proposes to avoid other threatened or endangered plant and animal species within the construction corridor. Additional threatened and endangered species surveys will be conducted during the 2019 field season. Any additional species identified during this survey would need to be addressed as part of the takings permit application. Again, the table of contents for this application identifies 10 specific sections. Sections 1 through 8 and Section 10 of the application materials contain general project information, with Section 9 containing specific information about the threatened and endangered species proposed for take. The 9 species that would be impacted by the project include narrow triangle moonwort, goblin fern, handsome sedge, pale sedge, sterile sedge, beaked spike rush, bog bluegrass, hair-like beak rush, red saltwort. The pale sedge is the only endangered species proposed for take. The other plants are threatened species. Before a takings permit can be issued, the applicant must demonstrate that the species cannot be avoided. Once the DNR has determined that all reasonable efforts to avoid a take have been implemented, we must consider how the proposal would affect the species distribution and status within Minnesota. A proposed taking may not negatively affect the species distribution and status. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. Additional surveys would likely be needed for project revisions and those portions of the route permit authorized by the PUC that had not been previously surveyed. Plant surveys need to occur during specific time periods of the growing season to ensure species can be properly identified. Once all species are identified, avoidance must be demonstrated. The DNR has not made a determination on the effects to the identified species and any mitigation that would be required, and will not make decisions for areas that have not been surveyed. Our next topic is water appropriations. A water appropriation permit is needed for pumping more than 10,000 gallons of water per day, or 1 million gallons per year. Permits can include conditions to protect and conserve natural resources, and for groundwater can include conditions to ensure sustainable groundwater use. Construction of the proposed Line 3 replacement project would require several different types of water use. The DNR evaluated the proposed water uses and required Enbridge to apply for 4 separate water appropriation permits. The first is a permit for hydrostatic testing and horizontal directional drilling. Water is needed to test the integrity of constructed pipe segments and as a water source for horizontal directional drilling activities. Proposed water sources for these activities include lakes, rivers, and wells. A permit for construction dewatering is needed for trench dewatering during construction and other dewatering activities associated with pump stations and the Clearbrook terminal expansion. Construction dewatering is the removal of surface or groundwater within excavations needed for construction. A permit for dust control water is needed to keep construction activities from creating nuisance dust conditions. Enbridge proposes to use water sources from lakes and rivers for dust management. And finally, a permit is needed for construction dewatering near Gully 30 calcareous fen. An individual authorization is needed near the calcareous fen to address special conditions and circumstances that may be needed to minimize impacts to this rare groundwater-fed wetland. The associated calcareous fen management plan will be discussed later in the presentation. Attachment A of the hydrostatic testing and horizontal directional drilling application is a table of the proposed water appropriation sources and locations, as well as estimated water basin drawdown from the appropriations. Attachment B contains site plans for each of the proposed appropriation sites. Discharges of water from these appropriations would be regulated by the MPCA under an industrial wastewater discharge permit. Other attachments include the Environmental Protection Plan and a typical discharge feature called a splash pup. Enbridge sent required landowner notifications to all landowners around lakes less than 500 acres that are proposed for water appropriations. Construction dewatering would be accomplished using portable pumps, and in some cases, a system of well points may be used. The total dewatering volume is estimated at 510.5 million gallons, based on previous pipeline construction in Minnesota. This calculation assumed 80 to 100% of trench volume would need to be pumped and added 25 to 50% contingency to account for potential weather conditions. Duration of dewatering would be variable depending on construction timing and precipitation. Dewatering would no longer be needed once excavations are filled. Water appropriation for dust control would be accomplished by filling water trucks or tanks that would then be used to keep construction areas moist. These appropriations would be needed throughout construction practices to prevent nuisance dust conditions. Water appropriation for construction dewatering near the Gully 30 calcareous fen would be subject to limitations and conditions contained in an approved fen management plan. Later in this presentation, we will discuss the fen management plan and the unique characteristics of fens with their connection to the water table and groundwater. Water appropriations must be reasonable and avoid negative effects to natural resources. Any unavoidable effects must be mitigated. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. The suitability and effects to resources from proposed pumping rates have not been determined. Each discharge location in practice must be suitable and not create excessive erosion, scour, or other negative impacts. Special care is needed for those water appropriations from proposed sources that contain aquatic invasive species. Fen management plans are required to address any activity that would impact a calcareous fen. Calcareous fens are rare groundwater-fed wetland communities that have unique water quality characteristics and plant species. Under Minnesota statute, the DNR must maintain and publish a list of known calcareous fens. These wetland communities cannot be impacted by development activities unless the DNR commissioner determines that alterations of the fen are necessary under an approved management plan that limits impacts to the fen. Enbridge proposes construction activities that would impact the Gully 30 calcareous fen in Polk County. The DNR authorized a fen management plan for Gully 30 for Enbridge's previous Alberta Clipper pipeline project. The Line 3 replacement project would have impacts to Gully 30 very near the previous Alberta Clipper impact. A draft management plan has been prepared for consideration by the DNR commissioner. The draft fen management plan addresses pre-construction site preparation and many specific construction activities. Examples of these activities include topsoil, sod, and substrate handling, pipe preparation, plant community and threatened and endangered species considerations, dewatering methods, County Ditch 89, trenching and spoil handling, pipe placement, and buoyancy control. The plan also addresses post-construction activities such as restoration and monitoring. No impact is allowed to calcareous fens unless the DNR commissioner determines some alteration is necessary under an approved management plan. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. Dewatering rates and discharge locations are important to protecting the fen. Specific criteria for release of monitoring and restoration requirements are still under development. Next is the Work in Public Waters permit. This would allow construction activities below the ordinary high water line that propose temporary or permanent changes in the course, current, or cross-section of a public water. Those public waters that are subject to utility license to cross are not required to secure a Public Waters Works permit because the license addresses the needed regulatory requirements of a Public Waters Works permit. These permits address construction activities and can require conditions to protect and conserve natural resources. Enbridge would be required to secure 2 separate Public Waters Works permits, one for construction across 5 public water wetlands that are not covered under the utility license to cross public water, and one for construction of a permanent bridge across the Willow River for an access road to a valve site. Section 3.0 of the Work in Public Waters application identifies the 5 public water wetlands proposed for pipeline constructions. Section 4.0 provides a summary of aquatic impacts that are anticipated to occur. The application also includes the Environmental Protection Plan and construction methods for wetlands and water bodies as attachments. This is a proposed permanent bridge for an access road to a proposed valve site. The application includes information on location, construction plans, areas proposed for fill, and a hydraulic report. Work in public waters must be reasonable and avoid negative effects to natural resources. Any unavoidable effects must be mitigated. Within these broad criteria, there are some specific considerations that have been identified for this project. The construction methods for public water wetlands and planned restoration activities would need to protect the resources. The application must ensure hydrology of the wetland and the Willow River is not adversely impacted by proposed construction activities. The DNR has assembled a panel from representative programs and the Commissioner's Office to answer questions to assist the public in commenting on Enbridge's applications. It is important to understand that this is not an opportunity to comment on the applications, but rather a chance to ask questions that would be helpful in your understanding of how and what to comment on. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible within the allotted time period. However, it is unlikely that we will be able to respond to all questions, so we will prioritize questions that are most representative of the ones we are receiving. All questions will be collected. When the webinars are complete, we will review the questions provided and develop a frequently asked questions document to address common or broadly applicable questions we have received. This document will be posted on the website, and notice of its availability will be sent out via a GovDelivery email. If you have not already, please sign up for the DNR's Line 3 replacement email notification service on the webpage mndnr.gov/line3. Again, that's mndnr.gov/LINE3. I'll now have the panel introduce themselves, and we'll begin the question and answer portion of the webinar.
Good afternoon. This is Assistant Commissioner Jess Richards.
Hello, this is Randall Doneen within the Division of Ecological and Water Resources.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Derek Hilding, and I work in the Division of Lands and Minerals.
This is Jess Richards speaking again. I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this final webinar regarding the Line 3 replacement project. And we're going to start off with a couple of questions that we have received a number of questions on over the course of these webinars. And I'll start with the first one, which is about the duration of the public comment period and how did we ensure that the public was informed about the comment period. And so I'll start with the second part of that first. The DNR used our GovDelivery system, news releases, and these webinars to help inform the public about the Line 3 project and the opportunity to comment. You can sign up for GovDelivery notifications via email on our website, and I'll give you that address in just a second. And the other question was the duration of the public comment period. And I think it's important to note here that none of the applications that are in front of us require a public comment period. Normally, however, the public water works permit and water appropriation permits do have a 30-day comment period for local governments. But we recognize there's a high level of public interest in this project, and so we elected to provide a 60-day public comment period for all of the applications. So if you go on to our website, which is at mndnr.gov/line3, and that's the number 3, you can enter your comments on that website in the comment submittal portal. You can also submit comments via the U.S. mail to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Attention, Line 3 Pipeline Replacement Applications, 500 Lafayette Road in St. Paul, Minnesota, 55155. And this address is also available on our website if you didn't catch that. And comments are due by 4:30 on May 17th. And I'm going to follow up with a related question that goes to a little bit more detail on the commenting. And the question that we've received a lot of is why have you restricted comments to specific applications rather than considering comments for or against a project? And I want to be very clear here that all comments are welcome, and including those that express support or opposition to the project. The most helpful comments will be ones that are specific to one or more of the applications pending before the DNR, and they'll address things like additional information that might be needed in the applications, identification of specific resource areas that warrant special consideration, recommendations on permit and license conditions or limitations, and then just in general, the application's consistency with state statute and rule. So opinions are welcome on the project, but comments that express support or opposition to the project as a whole don't really relate to the criteria that DNR must use in making our decisions. And we just want folks to understand that before they submit their comments. There's a few other details here that might be helpful. In an effort to efficiently identify and address specific comments that are provided through our online portal, we've provided a mechanism where commenters can identify the specific application that they wish to address. You can select all or just a number of the applications on the web page. Again, like I said, you can also submit comments by U.S. mail. And so the intent of the comment period is to provide information to the public about what Enbridge is requesting and to seek your input on the application information, on areas that need special attention, on permit conditions that you think we should consider. And to remember that the DNR's role here is to ensure that pipeline construction operation that's within our jurisdiction is completed in a manner that avoids or minimizes harm to natural resources within that authorized corridor in accordance with state law. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randall Doneen.
Thank you, Jess. Again, this is Randall from Ecological and Water Resources. A question that we've gotten sort of generally throughout these webinars has been about hydrostatic testing water. And the question is the hydrostatic testing water discharge put back into the same lake or stream that it was taken from? And for folks out there, hydrostatic testing is after the pipe has been constructed, they appropriate water and they fill up the section of pipe and they pressure test it to ensure that it has the integrity that it's needed. And then when the test is complete, they discharge that water back. And they do discharge it back to the water source that it came from in most instances. However, in some cases, they do propose discharges to filtration areas. In these cases, water would infiltrate into shallow groundwater near the lake or stream where the water is taken from. And now I'm going to turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Randall. Again, Derek Hilding with the DNR Division of Lands and Minerals. And we received a question here relating to the utility licenses to cross public land and public water. The question asks, how is it that only one permit is needed to cross public lands and one for public water bodies when there are several parcels of public land and several public waters that are being crossed? The answer to this question is that there is just one land license that covers all requested lands in the project and one license that covers all public waters in the project. DNR's utility licenses encompass the entire project. And the reason we do this is so that we can easily track the license for future monitoring and maintenance requests. And it is important to note that if there are site-specific conditions that are very likely on a project of this scope, those can be dealt with in special terms and conditions that are attached to the license. And I will turn it back to Jess.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, we've got a couple more questions on comments in general. One of them is about the permit process and how the DNR can allow a permit to cross public lands when there could be negative impacts to the environment as part of that crossing is the question. And I think it's really important here to state first that the DNR has not made any final decision on any of the license or permit applications, and we're really in the process of evaluating each of those at every crossing location to make sure that the methods will be protective of the environment. We need to fully assess these applications relative to state statute and rule, which does provide for the allow for the crossing of public lands if you meet the requirements of state statute and rule. I think the other thing important here to understand is that the PUC process is what approved the route for the project and the certificate of need. And the DNR will be looking at resource impacts and how to mitigate those impacts. The license and permits will be thoroughly vetted through our resource review experts in the DNR. They'll be informed by your public comments on these applications. And all of this will look through the lens of minimizing and mitigating effects and ensuring compliance with state law. And I had one additional follow-up question here on the comments that I discussed earlier. And the question was, how many comments have you received so far? And the answer to that is that we've received approximately 200 comments so far during the open public comment period. And I will then turn it over to Randall Doneen.
Thank you. Again, this is Randall Doneen with Ecological and Water Resources. I'm going to take a couple questions here, and then I'm probably going to turn it back over to Derek when I'm done. The first question coming in from our Clearbrook viewing station, folks out there at Clearbrook. When did the calcareous fen, Gully 30 is the fen we're talking about, become protected by the DNR? The Gully 30 calcareous fen was added to the DNR's official list of protected calcareous fens in 2009. It was discovered by Enbridge consultants during evaluation of an alternative route for the Alberta Clipper pipeline. This alternative route was being investigated to avoid a larger, higher quality calcareous fen called Chester 24. All right. Another question that came in, is how is it that Enbridge is considered a utility under Minnesota law when it is neither located in Minnesota nor serves a utility functioning in Minnesota? Well, this really isn't an aspect of the DNR regulatory authority. However, this specific designation is covered under the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission's regulations, and its a specific authority is Minnesota Statute 216B and Minnesota Rule 4210. And now I'm going to turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Randall. I have another question here relating to the utility crossing licenses. The question asks, what kind of conditions can be placed on DNR's utility licenses to reduce and mitigate environmental impacts? And the answer to this question is, I think it's important at the outset to recognize that DNR's utility licensing statute, which is Minnesota Statute 84.415, and DNR's utility licensing administrative rules, which are Rules Chapter 6135, require utility companies to minimize environmental impacts of their crossings. For this project, DNR's utility licenses would include terms and conditions that specify how Enbridge must mitigate environmental impacts. Examples of these categories of terms and conditions would include erosion control and revegetation measures, invasive species management, both current and future maintenance, operations, and repairs, installation methods, and environmental protection techniques. Enbridge would also need to comply with other applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations. And DNR resource managers are reviewing the applications and materials to ensure compliance with DNR's utility licensing statutes and rules. I will pass the microphone back to Randall.
Thank you, Derek. Again, this is Randall. I have, again, I'll take two questions here that I've received. One is, please explain what a frac out is. And then secondly, how can the uncertainty of a frac out allow for the DNR to even consider this as an approach? So in response to that, a frac out is an unintended surface release of drilling mud that is used in the horizontal drilling practice. So when they're drilling underneath the water source, they need sort of a lubricant, if you would, in the drilling. And then if that lubricant, in this case, this mud, is somehow breaks out of the drilling hole and then ruptures out into the surface water, that is called the frac out. And that is really the largest concern associated with this type of crossing activity. It's actually the preferred method for avoiding direct impacts to stream if a frac out can be avoided. So these types of methods are not conducted unless we have geotechnical surveys that identify that this horizontal directional drilling is an advised approach for those specific areas. And even in those areas where it is an advised approach, we're working with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to develop contingencies that would minimize any damage to the streams or other surface waters if a frac out were to occur. I'm going to take one more question here and then turn it back to Jess. This is back to a water appropriation question, and it's how much is Enbridge going to be charged for the use of all the water cited in these permits? Is Enbridge allowed to use the water for their construction needs free? What fees are charged for water appropriations? How can 500,000 million gallons of water appropriation be reasonable? So in response to this, Enbridge is required to pay for a permit application fee, high volume water use fees for application review, evaluation analysis, and annual water use reporting fee. The total fees won't be finalized until permitting decisions have been completed. DNR is still evaluating the requested water volume. The requested volume are between the 3 water appropriations combined that is spread between multiple installations across the project. As to the 500,000 million gallons, that is related to the pipeline trench dewatering of the superficial groundwater and any precipitation that occurs during construction. The 500,000 is based off past pipeline construction amounts recorded and an estimated 50% overage for the work. This is precipitation, which is unknown at this time. The trench dewatering will infiltrate back into the surrounding landscape. Turn it over to Jess.
Okay, thank you, Randall. I have a very simple question for me to answer. I appreciate that. Is Portage Lake referenced in the presentation in Hubbard County? And the answer is yes, it is, and it's located just northwest of Park Rapids. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Jess. The next question we have asks, have archaeological and cultural surveys been completed along the proposed route? The answer to this question is Enbridge is working with tribal governments, the State Historic Preservation Office, often called SHPO for short, and the Army Corps of Engineers to complete and document the findings of archaeological and cultural surveys. DNR archaeologists are currently reviewing the results from surveys that have been completed on state land. DNR will coordinate with the State Historic Preservation Office as required by the Field Archaeology Act on the results of this subset of the surveys that have been completed. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jess.
Thank you, Derek. We've got a couple of wetland-related questions here that I'll go through. And the first one is, wetlands are precious, and how is the DNR going to protect them? And the second one is, will Enbridge be required to purchase wetland credits if they disturb or destroy wetlands? And so to talk about the protection piece, the DNR evaluates all wetland crossings affecting DNR public water wetlands that are under our regulatory jurisdiction, and we apply conditions to minimize the damage. I mean, we'll have things that are involved in our conditions, such as the timing of construction activities or the use of mats or other measures to protect the surface of the wetland, or even the handling of topsoil, for example, in an area of a wetland. And also, we work closely with the United States Army Corps of Engineers to have conditions that are similar or ensure that there's protection both at a state and federal level of the wetlands. And with respect to wetland credits, Enbridge will be required to obtain wetland replacement credits for any permanent wetland impacts. And most of the wetland impacts for the pipeline would be temporary impacts with conditions put on construction to help ensure that those wetlands would recover. But they'll also be assessed and monitored via post-project monitoring. So the short answer to that, though, is yes, if there's permanent wetland impacts, the company would be required to provide mitigation credits. And with that, I will turn it over to Randall.
Thank you. I have another water appropriation question here I'll address. And it says, with the potential of transmitting invasive species as a result of water, or I'm sorry, the question is the potential for transmitting invasive species as a result of water discharge sufficient in itself to deny a water permit? So water appropriation permits will typically include permit conditions that address the potential to transport aquatic invasive species. This includes cleaning the equipment prior to moving to a new site and discharging the water either back to the same water source or away from other bodies that cannot prevent the spread of invasive species. If a specific discharge of known infested water were not able to address this potential spread, we would certainly work with any applicant to identify another water source so that we would prevent any future spread of water appropriations. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Derek.
Thanks, Randall. We received a question from the Floodwood remote viewing site. And the question is, will the DNR require stumpage permits and fees when Enbridge removes trees? If there is cutting on school trust lands, will any fees be deposited into the school trust fund? So the answer to this question is that under both DNR's utility licensing statute and the language in DNR's utility licenses, if they're issued, the language there would indicate that Enbridge could not remove merchantable timber, could not cut, use, remove, or destroy that timber without first paying the state the timber value as determined by the DNR. If timber is removed from school trust lands, the revenue from that timber would be deposited into the school trust fund, which goes to support K through 12 education. I'll pass it back to Randall.
Thank you, Derek. So I've got a few questions on threatened and endangered species here, and so I'll kind of take them all in a row here. Starting out with the first one, why is the permitting process moving forward while the necessary identification of threatened and endangered species has not been completed, as well as the lack of a determination on the effects and distribution and status of the species identified to date? So in response to that, an endangered and threatened species takings permit is required if a project proposes to destroy an individual of an endangered or threatened species. A permitted taking must create a net benefit to the species in the state, and so if any particular proposed taking would have a statewide effect on the species, that would be considered. The cost and benefit of each taking is considered separately. Consequently, the DNR can consider a proposed taking independent of another proposed taking by the same project. And so I think in whole, this determination of the distribution and status, that is what we are evaluating as part of the application. And the other thing to point out that it is about the individual plant in this case that we're looking at, and we need to look at all of them across the project. The next threatened endangered species question poses, What does it mean to take 9 different plant species? Does it mean they're proposing eliminating those species along the proposed route? So again, an endangered and threatened species takings permit is required if a project proposes to destroy an individual of an endangered or threatened species. So in this case, those are individual plants that would be taken as part of construction of the pipeline. A takings permit, if issued, would allow Enbridge to destroy only those individual plants identified in the permit. The DNR will only consider permitting the take of a species if it cannot be avoided by the project. It is unlikely that a taking would eliminate all individuals of a species in the vicinity of a project, since any individuals nearby outside the proposed route would not be disturbed by the project. All right, and to finish the trilogy on threatened and endangered species, what kinds of mitigation could be undertaken to address the destruction of species? State law requires that any permitted takings on an endangered or threatened species be mitigated to create a net benefit to the species being taken. The DNR achieves this net benefit through a wide variety of permit conditions. Examples include permanent protection of a population of the species elsewhere in the state, funding of needed surveys for the species, or funding for needed research to assist with conservation of the species. And next, I'm going to turn it back to Jess.
Thanks, Randall. Okay, we have a question on wild rice. Are there any wild rice lakes that will be crossed by the pipeline? And if so, what is DNR doing to make sure those lakes aren't harmed? Are we really open cutting and crossing wild rice lakes? So the project would cross 4 water features designated as listed wild rice water: Hay Creek, Portage Lake, Peterson Lake, and Moose Lake. Hay Creek would be crossed using horizontal directional drill method. Portage Lake, Peterson Lake, and Moose Lake would be crossed with an open cut technique. But the open cut crossings would be along the edges of the water body, and they do not cross across the middle of the water body. The methods of installation along with the applications are all currently under review by the DNR, and we certainly, of course, welcome your comments, specific comments on this topic. Information about these crossings and methods of installation can be found in the License to Cross Public Waters application materials, which are on our website. And I'm going to turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Jess. We've touched on this topic a little bit here today, but we did receive another question related to invasive species. The question asks, will construction equipment be required to be cleaned off as it moves from one area to another in order to avoid moving invasive species? The short answer to this question is yes. All construction equipment will be required to be cleaned when entering and exiting state lands and public waters. And that is a term that would be required under DNR's utility licenses if issued. Cleaning stations would be located where invasive species have been identified and would include pressure washers, compressed air, and hand tools. And again, as I mentioned, DNR's utility licenses would include terms and conditions specifically addressing invasive species management. And I will turn it back to Randall.
Thank you, Derek. Again, this is Randall with Ecological and Water Resources. This question is, has all the necessary data been submitted to the DNR's in the DNR permit request regarding horizontal directional drilling? And in response to that, we are still reviewing the application that has been submitted about these crossings and these specifically the information about these crossings. Once the resource review are complete, we will work with Enbridge to ensure we have all the information that's necessary to make our informed decisions. Related to that, we have another maybe broader question, which is, please explain in more detail the types of drilling mentioned. And I believe we've only talked about one drilling, which is the horizontal directional drilling, but there are other crossings that we've talked about For the water license, there is what's called a wet trench, which is an open cut trench crossing that involves trenching through a water body while water continues to flow in the stream and the work area. Another option for water license is a dry crossing. And this is done by creating a dry work area by damming the flow upstream and downstream of the crossing and pumping the water around the project area. And then the horizontal directional drilling is a third type of water crossing where they essentially have a work area set back from the stream bank quite a while, and they bore a flexible drill essentially that kind of goes down beneath the surface water and then comes up on the other side. For the land license, they propose, horizontal directional drilling and trenching methods, and then a third, which is called a boring method, which is essentially, it's a shallow boring method that doesn't make use of the horizontal directional drilling technique, but is more for getting underneath roads and that sort of surface feature. Turn it over to Jess.
Thanks, Randall. We have a handful of questions left that we're going to go through here. This one says, what happens once the comment period closes? And so once the comment period closes, we collect all those comments and we review all of them. And we use those to help inform our decision making, but also to determine whether we need any additional information from Enbridge. And if we do, we'll go and seek that. The DNR then also has to finish our own resource review for avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts. And then we'll determine whether any special conditions for the permits would be needed. But ultimately, then all of that leading up to a decision on whether or not to issue those licenses or permits. Once we're to that point, we'll develop findings for the basis of our decision and we'll release a decision. And I'll go over to Derek next.
Thanks, Jess. We received a good question here, which asks, is the DNR able to look at Enbridge's past performance in determining the Line 3 applications? The answer to this question is that each project and application the DNR reviews is considered independently for its compliance and ability to meet state standards and regulations. Over time, laws, statutes, rules, and other provisions have changed regarding state land and water crossings. Past projects have helped the DNR develop more strict guidelines and more protective language for our current utility licenses. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jess.
Okay, we've had a question about consultation with Minnesota's native tribes. And as you have probably heard or along the process, the consultation process started with the Department of Commerce consultation during the environmental review and certificate of need and routing process. But DNR leadership is in the process also of communicating with all 11 tribal governments regarding consultation for the Line 3 replacement project. In fact, we're holding our first consultation today up at the Fond du Lac tribe. And we are in the process of scheduling additional sessions with tribal governments that want to consult with the DNR. At the option of the tribal government, DNR and MPCA are offering the opportunity to consult jointly with our two agencies, recognizing that there's likely going to be issues of interest for tribal governments that span both authorities of the DNR and MPCA. And we really look forward to all of these valuable consultation sessions. Just going to check around the room here to see if we have any more. Derek?
Thanks, Jess. We had a viewer ask, can you provide a better explanation of construction dewatering? So construction dewatering is utilized for situations where construction is hindered by water. And I guess the typical example would be if there's a trench where then water is filling back in. Trenches during construction can have shallow groundwater flow as well as water from storm events. As I mentioned, this water can flow into the trench. In order to safely and effectively continue construction, the water needs to be removed from the trench, which typically happens with industrial pumps. Specific details regarding construction dewatering for this project can be found in the supplemental permitting data. and I'm going to turn it back to Jess.
Okay, thank you, Derek. We're going to wrap things up for today, and I just want to wrap things up by thanking all of you for joining us in this webinar today, both those that logged on with your individual computer and those that joined us in the viewing locations. Thank you all for participating. We had approximately 53 people on our webinars today. We really value your participation, and we hope that the presentation and the question and answers have been helpful to you. We also want to thank all of those of you who have participated with all three of our webinars, so we appreciate your time on those as well. If you're not able to attend some of our webinars, they will all be available on our website, so you can go and check those out. Again, we look forward to receiving your comments on the permit applications by May 17th. And as I mentioned earlier, you can submit those on our website at mndnr.gov/line3, and that's the number 3, or you can submit them by mail to Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Attention, Line 3 Pipeline Replacement Applications, 500 Lafayette Road, St. Paul, Minnesota, 55155. Again, that address is also prominently displayed on our website. So thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to receiving your comments. Thank you very much.